Thank you, Dr. Greisman, and also want to thank Dr. Weiner and Dr. Baird for inviting us and being part of putting this together for us. Gary and I actually did this presentation I think Dr. Baird was at Harborview about a year and a half ago when Gary and I did this presentation. And he and I tag team a little bit, and it took about 2 hours to get through the whole thing. So we figured that if I did it by myself, maybe we could do it in an hour. So that's actually Gary was on a trip yesterday and wasn't sure if he was going to make it back, so I'm doing it by myself. And we are going to try to cut it down to about 45 minutes. One of the disclaimers I want to make at the very beginning is Gary and I are pilots. We're not doctors. We don't pretend to know what goes on in your industry other than what we read about, what we learn about from talking to your experts. So the things that we talk about are from the aviation perspective. Crew resource management was initiated in the 1980s or introduced to the airlines in the 1980s as an aviation concept, but it became very apparent quickly after it was introduced that CRM, as it's known, is really universal to any critical outcome environment. And we'll get to defining what that is in a few minutes. Just get the technology working here. So the first thing that I was asked to do is provide some objectives. Georgia called me the other day and said, hey, we got to have objectives. And I kind of got the feeling that she sort of runs things around here, so I responded immediately. So we got 5 things we want to walk out of here with an hour from now. The first thing is I'd like you to be able to list 4 crew performance indicators. These are indicators that we will define shortly. Define what is a critical outcome environment. Identify in just one word what the difference is between a threat and an error. Name and describe the 2 primary threat categories. And then finally, kind of a homework assignment is I'd like you to give some thought to describing a latent threat in your environment, something in your job, a latent threat that you see. And you'll understand what I'm talking about shortly. This slide is actually the cover slide for this presentation. And as you'll notice, there's nothing on it about aviation or healthcare. And that's done on purpose. The reason for that is that, as I said before, this concept is really universal to any critical outcome environment. So what is a critical outcome environment? It's basically any environment where your actions or lack of action can result in death or serious injury. And I'm sure most of you have heard of high reliability industries, and it's much like that. The only difference being the outcome is, as I say, much more critical. High reliability industries might refer to a widget factory that has to have the same widget coming out every time for economic reasons. But in our environment, in the environment that I work in and the environment that you work in, the outcomes can be fatal if mistakes are made. So how are we going to get there today? We're going to talk about, I'm going to reinforce the parallels between our industries, give a brief example of why aviation and healthcare might be linked. I'll talk about crew resource management, the history of how it came about and why, and then we'll talk about what it is, what the magic formula is. Of course, this talk is based on an 8-hour class that we teach to corporate flight departments. So what I'll do is I'll touch on the high points, maybe take one example out of each performance indicator and give you an example, but obviously we're just scratching the surface, and you need to understand that when you see these things. We'll close with threat and error management, which is essentially risk management. It's what we call risk management in commercial aviation. And then finally we'll have question and answers. And as Dr. Greisman mentioned, Gary and I will stick around. I think we're allowed like 15 minutes or something like that, but we're certainly at your disposal since we're here. We'll be happy to cover any questions. And we found that the question and answer period is really probably the most interesting thing for us, because it really tells a lot about what you're thinking, and hopefully the exchange goes equally both ways. So the first thing that I wanted to mention was about parallels. And we'll talk about pilots. Every pilot likes to talk about pilots. It just goes with the territory. Pilot personalities are typically, they're highly trained, self-motivated, well-educated, and often they are ego-driven personalities. They operate in an environment that is complex, it's highly technical, often full of operational stresses. We operate the best equipment, most expensive equipment there is, where the consequences of errors can obviously be fatal. Doctors, by contrast, are, you guessed it, they're highly trained, self-motivated, well-educated, and often ego-driven professionals. They operate in an environment that is complex, highly technical, and often full of operational stresses, operating the best and most expensive equipment where consequences can be fatal. Now, who can argue with logic like that? And I'll stop the parallel comparison at that point, and I think you can see that there are some things that will cross over from one industry to the other. So now I want to talk about the background of CRM, where it came from, why we got to where we are, and what the final outcome was 30 years later. If we go back in time about 50 years, in the 1960s and 70s, was the beginning of the jet age, and jet aircraft were introduced into commercial aviation and made an impact that was probably could be compared to penicillin in healthcare. I mean, it was a tremendous impact. The aircraft made phenomenal advances. They could go faster, fly farther, fly higher. They carried more people and more payload. They were cheaper to operate. They could climb over weather instead of going around it. In general, they were safer. They were much safer than their piston engine predecessors. They were so much so that we sort of turned a blind eye whenever there was an accident, thinking, well, yeah, we just had an accident, but gosh, our accident rate is so much better than it was before. I mean, it just must be a cost of doing business. Well, then in the 1970s, the famous black box was perfected. And for those of you that don't know what a black box is, first of all, it's not black. It's orange, so it can be found, or there are actually two boxes. They're orange, so they can be found when they're sifting through the rubble of an accident. But the black boxes originally, like I said, there were two of them. There's a cockpit voice recorder, which is a continuous recording on a 30-minute loop. That's a time-stamped recording, so it like backs up for the last 30 minutes. So anytime there's an accident, you've got a record of the conversation that was going on in the cockpit, as well as the radio transmissions going back and forth. The other black box is the flat data recorder, which records physical parameters of the aircraft, pitch, heading, altitude, airspeed, acceleration rates in all directions, that sort of thing. Also time-stamped. And so whenever there was an accident, when these boxes were installed on an aircraft, they had a huge advantage in investigating what caused the accident. And in the 1970s, the FAA mandated that these boxes would be installed in aircraft. And when they started analyzing accidents, they were stunned with the results, because what they found was that it wasn't the airplanes that were crashing, it was the pilots. It was the crews, and it was the system that we had and the culture that we had that was causing airplanes to literally fly into the ground. And I'll give you three quick examples of that. 1972, Eastern 401, which was a Lockheed L-1011, a big jumbo jet. They had a landing gear indication problem in the middle of the night when they came into Miami to land. So they went into holding over the Everglades. So dark night, over the Everglades, no light reference below, so they were basically just like in an inkwell. So no outside reference. 3 guys in the cockpit. They went into holding at 2,000 feet, and for whatever reason, the autopilot went into a mode where it just went into a constant rate of descent and literally flew into the ground. Now, the cause of this was determined to be, the human factors part of it was determined to be, well, there were a number of things. There was a lack of automation monitoring. There were communication errors within the cockpit. They were not working together as a team. There were 3 guys in there discussing and troubleshooting what turned out to be a 59-cent light bulb. And the one guy was probably, in fact, I think one guy was down below the cockpit in the electronics bay. looking at trying to figure out how he could get the nose wheel down if it indeed wasn't down. And the other two pilots were up there, and who knows what they were doing, but whatever it was, they weren't working together as a team. They weren't communicating as to what we're going to do next and what their plan was. They just were kind of all in their own separate thing. Before they knew it, they were in the ground. 103 people out of 176 were killed for no apparent reason. Following that, I think most people that are probably over, well, my age, at least my age, are familiar with Tenerife. Tenerife is known as definitely statistically the worst aviation accident in history because of the loss of life. There were 583 people killed. Of course, we discount the 9/11 as being a separate thing. Two 747s on a foggy runway ran into each other. The cause, without going into all the details, were numerous. There were numerous causes, cultural things that were going on. There were communication problems between the tower and the aircraft. You had a Dutch crew speaking English to a Spanish-speaking tower, and you can imagine just that alone, what a challenge that might be. Then you had in the cockpit of the KLM airplane, the one that they finally determined was the one that was at fault, the captain was the senior check airman for the company. He was the guy. He was the face on the brochures, the KLM brochures. He was godlike. So if his ego wasn't boosted just by being the captain of a 747, which kind of went with the territory, now this guy was Superman. He was a god in those terms. And the other two crew members were fairly junior, fairly new on the airplane. And after they looked at the tapes, they realized these guys were just intimidated by this captain. I mean, he's a great guy, I guess, in real life, but they were afraid to say anything. And when they listened to the cockpit tapes, they realized they were trying to tell him, don't take off, you don't have clearance. He took off anyway. He had what we call a mission bias, where he had it in his head, I'm going to take off, it's time, I need to get out of here for time constraints. And even though he didn't have a takeoff clearance, he took off and crashed into another airplane. And then the final incident that I'm going to mention, and this is only three of many that occurred in that decade. A DC-8 crashed in Portland. Again, landing gear problem. They arrived in Portland with an hour of fuel. They held for an hour, and the co-pilot and the second officer were trying to tell this guy, we're out of gas. We're about to get in trouble here. And they kept hinting, and he wasn't buying it. He wasn't taking up until finally the airplane, one of the engines flamed out, and he said, what's that? And it was like, these guys were like, well, we've been trying to tell you for 10 minutes. We're running out of gas. And then finally the airplane flamed out 7 miles short of the field. And you'll notice from this picture, you'll notice there's no fire. Why? Because there's no fuel, nothing to burn. So after that accident, which occurred in December of '78, 6 months later, the NTSB, or the National Transportation Safety Board, which is kind of like, I would say kind of like the Institute of Medicine in a way, although it's a definite government agency, that they're the guys that go on scene and investigate whenever there is an aircraft accident. So the NTSB, the FAA, NASA, and industry leaders from all over throughout the industry decided they needed to do something because they were looking at this data and they realized these airplanes, those three that I just told you about, actually there were four aircraft involved, and numerous others throughout that decade were crashing for no reason, and for no reason other than the human factors. And so they thought, we've got to do something. So these guys convened in San Francisco in June of 1979 for 3 days, locked in a room, and what they came up with was, first of all, accidents. The accidents that they analyzed, they determined that 63% of those accidents involve flight crew error. Well, that's a huge percentage. I mean, that's really high. That doesn't mean that the accidents were solely caused by human error. In fact, most of the time something precipitated it, like a landing gear problem or something like that. But so it wasn't like they just decided to fly into the ground. But it's kind of like when a person comes into the hospital with, I don't know, pneumonia, and they die of a heart attack. Well, it wasn't like the hospital didn't make them have a heart attack. That was just a secondary thing that happened. But the point is that a tremendous proportion of our accidents had human error involved. And so then it was a matter of what to do about it. And one of the conclusions they reached at the end of this meeting was that the majority of these accidents that involve flight crew error could be contributed to leadership problems, communication, crew coordination, and decision-making errors, as opposed to technical proficiency. And when we talk about technical proficiency, at least in this context and at that time, we're talking about skills, about hand skills, flying skills, kind of like a surgeon's, good hands. But they're saying that the majority of these accidents were caused by all these other factors. People knew how to fly, they just weren't working well together. So the result of all this was we're having lots of problems. We had lots of errors happening. And this phrase, to err is human, is just not acceptable. And I think that Institute of Medicine report from 1999 that talks about medical mistakes refers to like 96,000 probable deaths caused by medical mistakes each year. The title of the report is "To Err is Human." Well, it's kind of misleading because, yeah, we make mistakes, but there is an acceptable level, and we were at a point that was definitely beyond acceptable. So crew resource management was introduced in the 1980s, and it was initially a voluntary program. It grew fairly quickly. I think United Airlines was the first company to embrace this concept voluntarily, and then all the other airlines kind of fell into step, kind of like when they raise fares. They all just amazingly follow one after the other. But it took about 9 years. But after 9 years, we saw our first major save in the United Airlines 232. If you might recognize this picture, this is a DC-10, another jumbo jet that landed in Sioux City, Iowa. And for those of you that are not familiar, it was an amazing feat. And where the aircraft had no hydraulics, they had no flight controls at all, and it was only steered, and the pitch rate was only controlled through the throttles. It was a team effort by 4 people in the cockpit, and then the evacuation and preparing the people in the back was a team effort by the flight attendants in the back. And every crew member on this flight credits Crew Resource Management for the successful outcome. A lot of people died in this accident, as you can imagine, but a huge number of people survived. I don't have the numbers right in front of me. I think, I did. 184 passengers survived out of like 280 or something. So. By all rights, this airplane should have been a total loss and probably should have lost everybody. But because of CRM, or they credit CRM with being able to bring this thing to the ground successfully. And then, of course, everybody's familiar with a year and a half or 2 years ago, I guess now, US Air 1549 that landed in the Hudson. And this, again, Captain Sullenberger and his co-pilot and all of his flight attendants credit CRM, credit the concepts and the things that they learned through the years and the things that they applied with having a successful outcome of that. Every passenger survived, and I think the worst that happened is maybe somebody had a broken leg or something. But it was a pretty amazing feat. So I want to show you for a second, we've got a reenactment of that video, and what I want to, or a video reenactment of that flight. And what I want to point out is listen to the conversation. You'll see, and all you'll hear on the conversation is the radio conversation between the controller and Captain Sullenberger. Now, they had 3 minutes and 32 seconds from the time that this accident happened till the time they hit the Hudson River. And in that time, there's a tremendous amount of radio traffic. Well, in the background, what you don't hear is there's a huge amount of coordination going on between the 2 pilots and the pilots and the flight attendants. And if you read the transcript of the cockpit voice recording, you can see that it's like these guys didn't have a chance to breathe hardly. They were so busy. So with that, we'll take a look at the reenactment of
Cactus 1549, 700, climbing 5,000.
Turn it up just a little bit. Okay.
Cactus 15.9, departure to contact, climb, maintain 15,000.
Maintain 15,000, Cactus 1549.
Apologize for the jerky video. I'm not sure what's going on there, but.
Cactus 15.9, turn left lane 270.
This is Cactus 1539, hit birds through lost thrust on both lanes, returning back towards LaGuardia.
Okay, you need to return a little body. Turn left heading of 220.
220.
Tower, stop your departures. Got emergency returning. It's 1529. He bird strike. He lost all engine. He lost the thrust in the engines. He's returning immediately.
Cactus 1529. Which engines?
He lost thrust in both engines, he said.
Got it.
Cactus 1529. We can get it for you. Do you want to try to land runway 13?
We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson.
Hi, Cactus 1549. It's going to be left traffic to runway 31.
Unable.
Okay, what do you need to land? Do you want to try to go to Teterboro?
Yes.
Teterboro, Empire. Actually, LaGuardia departure guy, emergency inbound.
Hey, you got
Cactus 1529 over the George Washington Bridge. Wants to go to the airport right now.
wants to go to our airport. Check. Does he need assistance?
Yes, it was a bird strike. Can I get him in for runway 1?
Runway 1, that's good.
Cactus 1529, turn right 280. You can land runway 1 at Teterboro.
We can't do it.
Okay, which runway would you like at Teterboro?
We're going to be in the Hudson.
I'm sorry, say again, Cactus? Cactus 1549, radar contact is lost. You also got Newark Airport up at 2 o'clock in about 7 miles. Eagle Flight 4718, turn left heading 210.
210, 4718. I think he said he was going in the Hudson.
Cactus 1529, you saw him?
That's pretty much how it ends. I'm not going to continue. The bottom line of all this, when you look at all the numbers, now those are a couple of anecdotal stories about what worked, and people testify, or testimonials, I guess you'd call them, of the fact that CRM has had an effect on the outcome of these accidents. But you can't argue at all with data. I mean, we're all into that kind of thing. My training is an engineer, and I think all of you are in a scientific field, and when you see the numbers, it's pretty astounding. In 1979, the year that CRM was first introduced, the accident rate per million departures was 7.1. In 2009, it was 0.71. That's 10 times reduction in accident rates. Now, that could be due to a number of factors. Technology has improved the way we do things, but certainly CRM has had a huge impact, and anybody in the aviation industry will attest to that. So what is CRM? The FAA defines it very simply. It's just basically a system of management that makes optimum use of all available resources to flight crew to ensure safe and efficient flight operations. If you were to state it a little differently and apply it, I guess that wasn't my last talk about parallels, but if you apply it to any other industry, any other critical outcome industry, CRM is a system of management that makes optimal use of all available resources to the flight, or to the crew, to ensure safe and efficient operations. Just take the word flight out and you've got the same thing. What resources do we have? Well, in aviation, we have inside the airplane, we've got the equipment, the technical procedural skills, contributions of the flight crew and other individuals. External to the aircraft, or external to the cockpit, we have air traffic control, maintenance, flight dispatch, flight attendants, and manufacturers' maintenance departments. These are all things that, doors that we have open to us if we choose to use them. And it seems obvious that we would reach out and use all these things, but it's not so obvious. And it was not in the 1960s and 70s. We really didn't consider all the options we had available. It's like all we knew was fly the airplane. And of course, the obvious question is what resources are available in the medical community to you in your day-to-day operations. So now I'm going to talk about the crew performance indicators. And there are 4 indicators that kind of define what makes a successful, gives a flight, or gives this situation a successful outcome. Those 4 indicators are communication, team building, workload management, and of course technical proficiency, which, as I said before, was previously defined as your flying skills. Now it embraces a little bit more professional, or a few more professional aspects. Communication. This picture, read it carefully, was sent to me from a doctor at Rhode Island Hospital. And I don't know how much of the literature gets, the bad gossip gets out to you guys, but the doctor that works at this hospital that I know sent me an article that they're being investigated by the state of Rhode Island, by the medical board or whatever, and they're actually considering, I don't know, shutting down the hospital or something because of medical errors. And when she sent me this sign, I'm thinking, well, if the person that's in charge of making signage has anything, if that's indicative of the way they do things in the hospital, I can see what, you know, there might be a problem there. Communication CPI involves briefing, involves, we talk a lot in what we do. It involves sharing operational decisions. If Gary says, you know, I think we need to go to such and such, we need to divert because of this situation, he talks about it. He doesn't just say, hey, call air traffic control and tell them we're going to take a heading of 120. He'll say, hey, you know, I think we need to divert because of this. Because I might know something as a co-pilot that he doesn't. And so we kind of share information about operational decisions. We encourage participation of all parties. All parties being not just the cockpit crew, but the people in the back end too. One of the things that CRM has embraced is the use of the flight attendants, because they're great observers of what's going on, not only in terms of mechanical issues, because they do sometimes come up with something and say, you know, I heard this weird noise, and they've saved our bacon a number of times because they hear something that we don't hear or sense up front. They also are key in identifying security issues. We obviously, in conjunction with that, we seek input from all parties. And assertiveness is another item that has been stressed. And when I say assertiveness, I mean when Gary says, you know, I think we need to go to XYZ, and I'm saying, you know what, I look at the weather at XYZ and it's wrong. We can have a discussion about that. And I'm not afraid, as his co-pilot, to step up and say that and have a civil discourse. Gary hasn't lost any of his authority as a captain, but at least I feel empowered to speak up, and that's a very key thing, a very key part of CRM that's made a big difference. And then critiquing is something that we, of course, we have every year. We have check rides, and we also, if something goes on in the cockpit, bad landing or whatever, sometimes you get off the airplane, you notice the cockpit door doesn't open for like a long time. Maybe they're having a discussion up there about what might have gone wrong, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing. One of the communication issues we have is language barriers. We have it. Gary and I both fly all over the world, and we fly. One of the routes that's just amazing to me is going from Amsterdam to India, and I'd say we fly over probably a dozen different countries, and every one of them has got a different accent. It's just like you really have to be listening. So this video is just an example of what can happen when communication is a challenge.
Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
True story. So, with regard to communication, the NTSB there's three lessons learned here that I want to go with, and communication is a big part of this whole CRM concept. Silence is not necessarily golden. In 2/3 of all the accidents that were examined and identified during this period of time, the NTSB determined that in 2/3 of the cases, somebody else knew something was wrong and they were afraid to speak up, or they hesitated when they could have shared the information, like the flight going into Portland that ran out of gas. It's obvious when you read the transcript, the cockpit voice recorder transcript, it's obvious these guys are trying to tell the captain, but they're afraid to, because the guys basically just pounded them down. So silence is not a good thing. Hinting and hoping. I presume you're all familiar with what that means, but in our context, the L-1011, the first crash that I showed you, there was an air traffic controller that was monitoring the airplane, and he could see the altitude that the airplane was at. And he saw him at 2,000 feet, and then he saw him to start slowly descend. When they got to about 900 feet, he saw they were descending into the swamp. And he said, his only words were, "How's it going out there, Eastern?" And when they investigated, when they had a hearing afterwards and said, "What were you thinking?" And he said, "Well, I didn't really want to tell him what to do, but so he didn't really share his observation. He just kind of made a hint that, hey, Eastern, maybe you ought to check your altimeter." But he didn't even say that. And the result was, of course, that this airplane crashed. And so that's a very extreme example of hinting and hoping. And then finally, crews that communicate the most make the fewest errors. And this is evidence that we actually put people under the microscope in simulators and test crews and actually make measurements of human factors, measurements of which ones under the same conditions, which crews operate the best, and the ones that communicate the best by far make much fewer errors. Team building is the second CPI, and it goes right along with communication. The essence of team building is leadership. And leadership comes usually from the captain, but it's actually shared. I mean, it truly is shared throughout our environment, because having the ability to speak up is leadership. And feeling empowered that you can actually say, "Hey, something's wrong," is a very, very important thing, and we are secure in that feeling. Again, it involves the entire crew. Conflict management is a big part of leadership and team building, because we don't all get along. Let's face it. It's just part of human nature. Adaptation to the situations going on, and of course, stress management is another constant factor in all of our careers. Now I'm going to show you a video. This is one way to deal with operational stress.
Welby, check your final position. I'm going to take her down.
Wait a few more minutes, Skipper.
Do as I say.
Well, it looks like...
Do as I say.
Give him a few more minutes.
I've already waited too long. Here we go.
No, we don't. Get him.
So we have a little different way of dealing with operational conflicts, and we actually have a systematic way to deal with it that is just kind of ingrained in what we do, and it's a very simple four-step process. If we see a problem, you get the person's attention, and to get their attention, you use their name, Joe, or captain, or doctor, or whatever. You state the problem clearly, but here's where things fall apart. If you just state the problem and stop there, you're nagging. But if you propose a solution, that's different. So if you got a valid solution, you've made the next step, and then finally you have to seek agreement, because that kind of seals the deal. That closes the deal for you. Because when you seek agreement and you ask somebody, okay, here's what I see as the problem, here's the solution, don't you agree? They got to say yes or no. And once they say yes, they're committed. And it's a very tried and true method to get things done. For example, I say, Gary, we only have 16,000 pounds of fuel remaining. We need to land now or divert immediately to whatever our alternate field is. Don't you agree? It's that simple. Workload management is the next CPI, and the indicators are the I guess the subheadings of that topic are distribution of the workload, proper distribution, and that usually comes again from leadership. It's usually whoever's in charge of the aircraft at that time will say, hey, could you make this radio call and I'll fly the airplane, or whatever. Prioritization, again, what needs to get done first. Time management is combined with prioritization, because you may not have enough time, and you can bet that when Captain Sullenberger flew that airplane into the Hudson River, they didn't get through all their checklists. It wasn't going to happen. In fact, speaking of checklists, this is the checklist, the emergency checklist from the A330. So you can imagine, and this is the same thing with the Airbus that they flew into the Hudson. You can imagine trying to find your way through that and figure out what you got to do in 3 minutes and 32 seconds. It's not going to go well. Unless you prioritize and say, this is what we got to do right now, and then manage your time appropriately. And then, of course, maintaining situational awareness. I've got another video that's an example of really good time management. This is not a funny one. This is one that actually was a Navy aircraft that right after takeoff, they ingested a bird into the engine, shut the engine, it shut the engine down. And the two pilots, there was a student in the front seat and an instructor in the back seat, and they worked very well together. The instructor was the cool one. And when I say that, I really mean it. You could tell that this guy had thought about this scenario long before he ever stepped in the airplane. And so he knew right what to do, and it just followed a very perfect cadence. Now the other guy, the instructor or the student in the front seat, you can tell who he is when you listen to the breathing and the oxygen mask and the hyperventilation going on.
I can do close right stop.
Conclude right.
I can do.
Bird right there.
Oh, shit. Okay, we got
T6NL. T6NL.
Off the engine.
Okay.
Okay, around the horn, restart. Start abandoned aircraft.
Gear
with
not
you, buddy.
done.
Pass.
Gear not done.
Just gonna try to get a relight going.
Okay.
Get her from the front.
All right, get in the
I'll
front.
fly the plane.
Okay. Okay, engines up. Stop.
Okay,
Okay, you cool?
second, see the engine. Too hot. Okay, you ready to go?
T6NL.
I'm ready.
Okay. And Mike and 2, we're ejected to the north. We have an engine failure. Okay, prepare to abandon aircraft. Eject, eject, eject.
Mike and 2, copy your brake half to the north.
That's the end of that. But I don't know if you could hear the audio well enough, but you could really tell the guy was just going through the paces. He knew he had a limited amount of time to do what he had to do. He shifted gears as soon as he realized that the engine wasn't going to start, and went right into the ejection sequence. Talking to the other guy, saying, "Okay, you ready? How you feeling?" And then when it was at the very last minute, they ejected from the airplane after communicating what was going on, rather than just like pulling the handle. The other part of workload management, and I'm just going to pause at this point and talk about fatigue. This is one of the things that I'm going to extract out of this to talk a little bit about. Because fatigue is a really big factor for us, especially Gary and I fly internationally all the time, and so sleep management is just a big, big problem. And I know that in the medical community, especially in the hospital environment, for residents and so on, sleep is a big problem as well. Obviously, it affects memory, and I can attest to each one of these things. Items get skipped, you forget things, you get reduced attention span, you don't see things as well, you get moody. If you get moody, that affects everybody. And you're more accepting of your own errors. Your motor skills are not as well tuned as they should be, and your timing is off. We have a guy named Dr. Mark Rosekind that I've seen about 3 different times. He's well known in aviation as being the sleep guy. His life is studying sleep patterns. In fact, now he works for the NTSB as an accident investigator because fatigue is such a big factor in aircraft accidents, or can be. And when I've seen him talk, one of the factoids that he puts out there, and he's done a lot of research through the years, and one of the things that he puts out there is that we all require different amounts of sleep every night. I require about 6 hours. Somebody else might require 8, somebody else might require 10. And you kind of know what that is. But if you short yourself by 25%, in other words, if I go from, if I normally need 8 hours and I go to 6 hours, just a 2-hour sleep debt has the performance equivalent of a 0.05 blood alcohol content, which in Europe, that'll get you thrown in jail. Here it's 0.08, but still, it's significant. So do you want me flying your aircraft if I've got a 0.05 blood alcohol content? I don't think so. That'd be the equivalent of having a beer, I suppose, or something like that. And likewise, I wouldn't want the guy operating on me to have a sleep debt either. But that's just a 25% sleep debt. If you go to 50%, it goes up, and at some point you're legally intoxicated without even having a drink, as far as performance is concerned. And the final topic is technical proficiency. And technical proficiency is basically talking about your technical skills. I talk about adherence to SOPs and FARs. Of course, the acronyms here are are aviation-related. SOPs are standard operating procedures. FARs are federal aviation regulations. So adherence to policies and regulations are part of technical proficiency. That discipline is like really important, obviously. Then that includes checklist discipline, which I'm going to expand on that subject in just a second. Obviously, you have to demonstrate technical knowledge, knowledge of aircraft systems, normal and abnormal procedures, emergency procedures, and operating limitations. I'm going to digress just a little bit and talk about checklists. And I don't want to talk about something you guys are already really familiar with, but I know that checklists are a hot item, particularly in operating rooms right now. My next or my most recent favorite nonfiction author is Dr. Atul Gawande. And I don't know how familiar everybody in this room might be with him, but he's the guy that wrote, he's written several books. He actually hung up his lab coat, and I think he's changed careers, and now he's on the lecture circuit and writing books about medicine. But he's actually a very good writer. And when somebody told me you should read this book called The Checklist Manifesto, I'm going, how could you write a book on checklists? But it's actually pretty good. And out of that book, one of the things that he talks about is where checklists in aviation came from. So I'm going to digress just a little bit, and for those of you that don't know, I'll tell you because it does pertain to what we're doing. In the 1930s, the Army put out a request for a new bomber, and Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, or Martin Douglas, I guess, were the last two competitors standing for this competition for this new long-range bomber. The Boeing product was clearly superior to the Douglas product, and would have been a hands-down winner, except for when they had a fly-off one day. The Boeing aircraft took off, went like that, and just came right down and crashed. The cause of that was that the pilot had left the gust locks in the elevator and the rudder, and so the airplane was basically uncontrollable, and he didn't realize that until after he took off. It almost bankrupted Boeing. The contract went to Douglas for this new bomber, but Boeing persevered. The engineers and the pilots got together and said, what can we do to prevent this? And what they did was they came up with a checklist that fits on a 3x5 card, a pre-flight checklist. The airplane continued to fly, or not the airplane that crashed, and that's what it looked like, but the other prototypes they had continued to fly for 1.8 million miles, proving itself with no further accidents, and the Army finally bought it, and in fact they bought 13,000 of them throughout World War II and designated it the B-17. Just because of one little checklist. Solved problem. Checklists in healthcare, and this is where I'm going to deviate a little bit from the aviation field because some of you may not be aware of this that have not read that book. But there's a Dr. Peter Pronovost at Johns Hopkins University was convinced in 2001 that checklists were the key to solving a lot of medical errors, particularly in the ICU where he was focusing. He chose the ICU because he could control the environment very effectively. So he developed a 5-step checklist, and once he got 100% compliance with this checklist, the outcome or the results of that were outstanding. The checklist was wash your hands, wear sterile gowns and masks when you do the procedure was a central line infection. He was trying to influence how central line infections were happening, and so that's where the checklist came from. After the gloves, clean the insertion site with whatever that is, chlorhexidine. Place sterile dressing over the site after the insertion, and then when they're done, when they don't need the catheter anymore, pull it out. Those five items reduced their infection rate, their 10-day rate, from 11% to 0. And over a 15-month period, their annual rate went down to, they prevented 43 infections, 8 deaths, and saved the hospital $2 million for a 5-step checklist. If that doesn't convince you that there's some merit to that, I don't know what will. The final thing, I know I'm running late. I hope, how are we doing? Okay, are we doing all right? Okay. The final section that I'm going to talk about is threat and error management. And that's kind of like the, like I say, that's risk management for aviation. The difference between threats and errors, one word, timing. Threats are events that have not happened yet. There are things down the road. Errors, by contrast, are things, actions or inactions that lead to deviations from what we wanted to do. Of course, no human factors lecture would be complete without the James Reason Swiss cheese model that I'm sure all of you have seen. But basically, we've got barriers set up throughout our system. Checklists being one, manuals of procedures and policy being others, regulations being others. Somewhere along the line, when there's a threat, one of these barriers should deflect the threat and cause it, keep it from happening. Of course, if for a threat to result in an error, all the holes in the Swiss cheese line up. There's a hole in each one of those barriers that go up, and we end up with an incident, an accident. That's a very elementary way to look at it, but it's very true and reflects the problem very well. As far as the types of threats that we have two types that we talk about: active threats and latent threats. Active threats are threats that are right in front of us. They're the operational threats that we see every day. They're the car that's speeding down the highway when we try to cross the road. In my case, it's the line of thunderstorms that I see at 100 miles on the radar. What am I going to do? Am I going to go over it? Am I going to go around it? Am I going to go back and land somewhere? Latent threats are the sneaky little devils. They are the threats that are in our system. They're written in our policies. They're sometimes cultural differences that we might have, but they're threats that will sneak up on you and bite you, and you don't even realize it. And those are things that need to be identified and then changed when they happen, or when they're identified. I'll give you one example of a latent threat. This is, and very briefly, I won't go into a lot of the detail of this, but this is a United States Air Force Thunderbird pilot who is doing a demonstration. The latent threat is in their policy and how they set their altimeters. Seems kind of simple, but basically they set their altimeters to sea level, so when they're at 3,000 feet, their altimeter reads 3,000 feet. So if the field elevation is 3,000 feet and they have to start a maneuver 2,000 feet above the field, that means they got to add 2 and 5 and, oh, what's that? Or 2 and 3, and that's 5, right? Well, it's because of that extra step, being under stress and having to do that little extra math step, and Air Force guys not being very smart. It sets them up for a potential error. And the difference between doing it the way they did it and other flight demonstration teams is other flight demonstration teams would, when they're at the end of the runway for takeoff, they set the altimeter so it reads 0. So no matter where they are, they know how high they are above the ground. So here's what happened with this, the end result of this latent threat.
I think 153 okay. 2 clear, 4. Smoke gun ready now. Smoke gun ready now. Left turn. Continuous left. Fire up. 605.5. Middle, more pull. Speed 4. Cruise okay after 1. 1 left turn.
Ouch. The good news is, to lift the suspense, nobody got hurt. The pilot actually ejected just before impact, and this picture is actually a picture taken from the ground. It looks like the airplane is actually going to land in all these cars, and as it turns out, he didn't hit anything. And I think he got some cuts and scrapes and bruises, and of course, the title to the slide is 0.8 of a second before career termination, because after that point, he was done. No more Air Force. Managing threats, basically the way we manage them starts with identifying, classifying a threat, how serious it is, avoiding the threat if we can. That's the key thing we do. Trapping a threat, if we can't avoid it, we trap it, we deal with it in whatever way we can to mitigate the potential consequences. And the final step is reporting threats if it's appropriate to report them. Errors, on the other hand, very similar process. You identify the error, avoid situations where errors are going to happen if you can, and if you have an error, you correct it, you fix it, you mitigate it. And again, the key to our system is reporting it, and this is something that gets a lot of it. We've had a lot of discussion over the last couple of days about this, that our reporting system is very robust and works very well. We actually, just to kind of sidetrack on that a little bit, it has really saved a lot of heartache and lives and so on. And the way that it works is when we have an error, when we make a mistake, like I bust an altitude, I'm assigned to go to 10,000 and I get distracted and I fly to 11,000. If I turn in a report and say, you know what, I had this thing going on in the cockpit and that distracted me, and I turn in a report to this event resolution committee, that error is looked at and I am exonerated from any prosecution. There's no way that they can do anything. And the only way they can prosecute me for that error is if I do it intentionally. But if it's a mistake, honest mistake, we're off the books. And the advantage of this is let's just say that happened to me and it happened to 10 other guys in a week at the same location. Well, it's got to tell you there's a trend there. There's something going on that may be something out of my control. There might be a conversation that happens at 10,000 feet that distracts every pilot at that location every time. And so, so when we identify a trend through this event resolution committee, we can do something about it. And we actually take action. It might be talking to a controller or changing a procedure or whatever it takes. So where we are right now, you look at 1977, this is a reenactment of the Tenerife accident where the two 747s collided, and 2009. We've come a long ways. You can see from the statistical data, we have really made some tremendous improvements in safety. In terms of aviation versus healthcare, of course, this is a repeat of the slide that you saw earlier with our statistics that we've had over the last 30 years. About 2 years ago, I talked to one of the board members from the Institute of Medicine that put out the report in 1999 about medical mistakes, and they came out with that statistic of 96,000, approximately 96,000 deaths due to medical errors. At that time, this was 2 years ago, this guy named Roger Herdman that I spoke with said that things really hadn't changed a whole lot. They really hadn't. So it's kind of up to you guys, and I think because of the fact that you invited us here to talk, that there's an interest in hearing how someone else succeeded at turning a culture around. I think that's a good sign, and that you're making the right steps toward correcting whatever problems that you have. And I'm going to quote from my most recent favorite nonfiction author, Dr. Gawande. He says, "Failures of ignorance we can forgive. If the knowledge of the best thing to do in a given situation does not exist, we're happy to have people simply make their best effort. But if the knowledge exists and it's not applied, or not applied correctly, it's difficult not to be frustrated." Well, the knowledge exists, and it's up to you guys to determine how and when you're going to use it. Thank you. So we're open to questions. Yes?
There are times when the human is to blame. You've talked about turning in reports where maybe it's situational, maybe you can find a pattern, but there's times when somebody really did mess up and it's due to many factors in their own personal life. How have you guys as an industry tried to approach that?
Depends. And most of the errors that we're talking about are human errors. I mean, like when I break an altitude, it's not a machine problem, it's a system problem. It's either a personal problem or a system that pushed me into that corner. So reporting is one way that we deal with it, and if we see a trend, then we try to deal with the system. On an individual level, we do have another route that we've used, or that we do use, and that's the professional standards. And I don't know what the equivalent would be in healthcare, but just as an example, I flew with a guy many years ago that he had been on a medical leave for about 3 or 4 years. He came back, and I was on one of his first trips with him. The guy was just missing everything. He was missing altitudes, he was missing calls. We went to a field where the taxiway went to the runway like that, and you could either turn right or left. And we had to go like to the right, And he started turning left. And I said, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I had to step on the brakes because he was not listening to, he didn't hear me. And so this was so bad that I went to the union. I went to the professional standards. I said, hey, can you take a look at this guy? And the feedback that I got was that he was eventually removed. They said he shouldn't be flying. He was medically incompetent. And so we do have, we have several systems in place to do that. But that was an individual level, where somebody was truly had a problem. But as far as flying goes, I mean, we all, at this point in our careers, have the skills. It's just a matter of, if it's a system problem, and that's usually where it lies, then we address it with reporting. And
we touched a little bit. Is this working? Yeah. We touched a little bit upon this with Noah prior to this meeting. And again, getting back to these, what we call event resolution committees, we do find that most of our errors that get reported are human type of errors. We thought that as the airplanes became more complex and more automated, our jobs would actually get easier, and what really happened was they got more difficult with the increase in the automation, because we found that we weren't very good monitors. We had to start coming up with ways to monitor all this fancy equipment that was now sitting in the cockpit. So getting back to where we find the human errors, what we really look for in the human errors is trends. Are we seeing the same type of error repeated over by maybe this individual? Is it his problem, or are we seeing this in a cultural problem within a specific aircraft in a specific region of the country? So what we try and do, and what's really helped us, is all the data collection that we've done to see, is this a one-time event with a one-time person, or are we seeing trends? And then we can decide how to fix the problem. And that fix might be more training. We might look at ourselves as instructors and say, are we doing the job? Did we drop the ball and not train this individual correctly? Or did we design a procedure that's maybe faulty? And did this person err because maybe the procedures that we have in place, or the given checklist that we have in place? So, even though we find that we do see a lot of these errors come from the actual pilot or individual, a lot of times there's always the contributing factors. And by having these event resolution and no threat type reporting environments, without them we'd never get to the source of the problem.